Okay, I want to speak a little bit about what I will term clickbait journalism. I'm going to cover some wider issues, but just for want of a better term for now, I'll call it clickbait journalism. Now, what I mean by this is reports, mostly on YouTube, that are usually no longer than 2 minutes, and which attract you by some sort of quirky fact or detail. Now, on the surface, I have to say, I really see no big problem with this. I appreciate that news agencies cannot have a big, lengthy report for something that is, in most cases, rather trivial. To give an example, I've watched a report on monkeys in Thailand being fed at some sort of spiritual festival. People in a temple there believe it brings good luck, so these macaques are being fed. Now that's about 1 minute 30 seconds. That's probably all that needs. There's a lot of other reports like that that are fun, quirky sort of facts. They're not heavy political things. They're just funny sort of facts. However, I do think it's a problem when the issue that is clickbait is a more important, heavy political issue, because in those situations there are implications. Now, realistically speaking, something like the first story I mentioned isn't really going to be a major heavy political issue. It's just a fun sort of report. And there's other examples like that. Like there was a charity colour marathon where people get covered in coloured powder every kilometre. Again, that's harmless. It's not a heavy political thing. It's just a fun story. But I do think we live in an era where journalism is moving at a faster pace than ever before. If you look at news reports today compared to, say, breaking news of to give an example, I saw a report on John Lennon's assassination in 1980. It was quite slow moving, wasn't 24-hour footage like we have today. They had a few interviews, they had updates and so on, but it was quite a slow report. Now, if that happened today, if you had an assassination of a famous person, it would be immediate sort of breaking news, and you'd automatically tell a different style. Now, I think there are some advantages to a 24-hour news cycle, because it keeps people updated on a regular basis. It can bring breaking news as it happens. Whereas in the past that wouldn't have been the case. So I do think that there's advantages to that. One thing though I am skeptical of is that you get situations whereby public figures say something and inevitably they have to be absolutely clear what they're saying, otherwise it will be taken out of context. And I think that's unfortunate, partly because it's not fair on the person speaking, but also, just as importantly, it misinforms the watching public as to what someone has said. So I guarantee you that most editors will focus on the dramatic part of the speech and not necessarily the true implication or meaning of what the person is trying to say. Now, if someone's going to say something dramatic, and they're a public figure, they have to expect some response. But I also think that very often things are taken out of context, and unfortunately we're in such a situation now that public figures cannot even complain about that, because they know that the power of the media is such that the media will just turn around and say, oh well, you're a public figure. Basically they can't even defend themselves, because we're in a situation where the news cycle is so fast that if a mistake is made, there's barely even time to amend it. Now, when the tabloid press, and okay, they've been around for a while, but when they make a mistake, I guarantee you, they will not make an apology on the front cover. They will make a small apology on page 23, whereas the initial damage is a large headline on the front page. So there's no balance whatsoever. So I do think public figures can be crucified, for want of a better term, by a very, very powerful media. Another thing I'd like to point out, it is true that pretty much every media outlet has some bias or another. Now, there are certain media outlets I watch more than others, and there are certain media outlets that have a clear bias and I frankly loathe. But sometimes, for example, I've went out my way to criticise networks like RT because it's a state mouthpiece, and I've criticised Xinhua for similar reasons. It's a state mouthpiece for China. I've criticised Fox News. And it's not like I've defended other networks, but I've sort of been a little bit more loyal to other networks. To give some examples, BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, I've always regarded them as a bit more professional. But over the course of this year, I've come to think, well, actually, there is no network that is without bias. Some are a bit more obvious about it, but the truth is, I have not come across a single news network that I can think of that doesn't have some bias or another. None. Honestly, none. There are some, like I said, will watch more than others, but the truth is they all have some bias, so I think people need to be objective when they watch TV news. Having said that, I don't agree with those who say that there are people who say, oh, it's all lies, we never watch any of it. Well, there's a few problems with that. If you never watch TV news, if you never read newspapers at all, then how do you find out what is going on in the wider world? Now, people say, oh, well, from my own experience. But practically, you cannot travel to every country. So I'm a bit skeptical of people who say that they will not watch it whatsoever. Now, I can understand them watching it and saying, oh, well, we need to be careful what we see and we cannot believe everything we hear. That's completely legitimate. But what I don't understand is people who say that they think they're being enlightened by not watching it at all, or not reading newspapers at all. And they say, oh, well, I find out for myself. But I'm thinking, well, that's all very noble, but how exactly do you do that? I mean, you can find out based on your own experience. But another point, by the way, own experience is not actually everything. If you go to a country like North Korea, your own experience, do you think they're going to show you the torture chambers? Of course not. I've seen people, frankly, make themselves look rather ridiculous. Westerners who have been in certain countries, let's say, which do have reputations for serious human rights abuses, and these people turn around and they're, frankly, to me, they're useful puppets, because they turn around and they say, oh, the Western media badmouths these countries and it's not that bad. Well, I'm thinking, yeah, but they're not going to show you the bad side, are they? Just because you haven't personally seen it doesn't mean it's not happening. So whilst people should take the media cautiously, you cannot say that you cannot rely entirely on your own experience. You just can't. Because the fact of the matter is, you're not going to have access to all of that information. Whereas freelance journalists, or journalists who in some cases are risking their lives, are going to have access to a lot more information than you are. So sometimes we do have to rely on the media, because it is the only way to find out about the wider world. But we do need to be objective about it and not automatically believe every single thing they say. We also must scrutinise the media just as much as we scrutinise politicians. So I think we live in an interesting era. I think the news media is immensely powerful. Actually, I would argue they are a lot more powerful than any politician. Any politician. It could be argued that the superpower today is not the United States. It is the collective global media. Because we live in an era where it is so influential, and this clickbait journalism is so powerful that it impacts all of us. It impacts our thinking, it impacts, in some cases, it even impacts revolutions. So, I think basically it's a bit like the internet. There's a good side and there's a bad side. The good side is it spreads knowledge, it spreads information. However, it could also arguably just be spreading propaganda. But I don't think that. I think for any major news network, it's not that they're lying. I don't think that is the case. I think that is they're picking and choosing. For example, when I say I hate Russia Today, it's not that their reports are inaccurate. I mean, they report about protests in the US and the UK. It's not that they're inaccurate. It's that they clearly have an anti-Western agenda. In other words, all the reports they have about Britain or America or any other European country are negative, and they never have objective reports on Russia. So it's not that they're wrong in what they're reporting necessarily, although I would argue that you need to be very careful about their reports on Ukraine. But leaving aside Ukraine, the reports they would make on Britain and America, okay, they're reporting protests, those protests are going on, but it's quite obvious this is only just to get at the West, because the West has reported maybe about protests in Russia. And likewise, so it's almost like media networks have taken it upon themselves to get involved in this political chess game, and they're almost acting as, even though to some extent media networks are independent from political parties, you still have a situation where there's an obvious national bias in many networks. Now, as much as I think CNN has been professional in recent, I think they've been really stirring things up in Ferguson in terms of race baiting. I do think they've been guilty of that. So I think every major network we need to take very cautiously. There is no major network I can think of that doesn't have some bias or another. Al Jazeera on the whole is a good network. They do some good investigative reporting. However, I would argue they're very biased when it comes to the Holy Land conflict, Israel and Palestine. Fox News clearly has a bias towards American Republicans and the right, despite their claims to be against big media. They are big media. CNN arguably does have a liberal bias. RT has a pro-Russian bias. The BBC, here in the UK, it has a reputation for having a pro-left bias. In fact, the BBC, because it's so big, it's being targeted by just about everybody for having some bias or another. Chinese state media, needless to say, has a bias towards the Chinese government. So the truth is, there is no network that can truly be called independent, and it would be refreshing just for once to see a network that is entirely neutral, that has no national bias. Sometimes I kind of look at networks, I think, well, they seem quite professional. I'll sort of look at France 24 or something like that. But then, probably if you look a bit deeper, France 24 probably has a pro-West bias, I don't know. It's not one of the better known networks. Euronews probably has a bias towards the EU, which Russia would allege. I've seen African networks that clearly have a pan-African bias. So the truth is, every media network, whilst they might say that they don't, I think inevitably they do, all have some bias. Now the question is it possible to really avoid this? A bit like, is it possible to avoid corruption in high-level politics? Well, is it possible to avoid bias in high-level media? So that's a question I'm just putting out there. It would be nice if the answer was yes, but I cannot think of any major network that doesn't have some sort of bias or another. Now granted, there will be networks I will watch a bit more than others, but that doesn't mean I absolutely endorse everything that they're saying. I've basically taken issue with just about every network at some time or another. So I try to be open-minded, I try to be objective. But inevitably, you have to get knowledge somehow. Now you could go by interviews, you could go by statements, you could go by your own eyes. But most news reports are edited down to some level. Now sometimes that is just practical reasons. Because, for example, if someone makes a 2-hour speech, practically it wouldn't be realistic or even fair to expect a news network to show a 2-hour speech. However, I do think we live in an era where people often are taken out of context. So there's a lot to consider, really. obviously people in the public light need to be responsible in what they're saying, but I do think that networks and editors also need to take some responsibility and not portray things inaccurately. And of course this then starts this sort of cyber reaction where you get nationalistic people get really pissed off if their country seems to be being targeted. So there's a lot of issues to consider. Let me know your thoughts. And by the way, if you're going to attack a specific network, I would ask that you back that up, because I can see fault in all the networks.